Well, today we're having our second presentation that's brought to you by an old rock and roll group. In this case, our presentation today is sponsored by the Lovin' Spoonful, another group from the 1960s, and they put out a song called "Do You Believe in Magic" at one point in their existence, which again I am appropriating for the purpose of illustrating today's lecture. So we're going to take on the issue explicitly of magic. Do you believe in magic? Turns out a lot of humans do, even if it's in contradiction to the notions we have ourselves as being logical and rational and all of that stuff. Most of us have some belief in things that could be considered magic without an evident physical basis to support them. So we'll look at that today, including a fairly extensive look at the evolutionary trajectory that this faculty may have had in humans and why it would have been selected for as part of our genetic and behavioral repertoire. First of all, we'll take a look at what we mean by magical beliefs and whether or not we can be said to have them in the modern day. Then we're going to talk about the two elements that behaviorists consider to be part of those magical beliefs. They are, in part one, this thing called patternicity. In part three, we'll look at the other aspect known as agenticity. So the idea that humans might have magical beliefs are usually the sort of thing that we assign to Walt Disney movies. You know, you got your fairies and your leprechauns and your elves and animals that can talk and all of that. And it's something that we embrace and enjoy in childhood, but then we hit adulthood and we give all that up, right? Well, maybe. Before we get into this in depth, I want to make this point explicitly that when we talk about magical thinking, we're not particularly talking about religion. We are talking about another human belief system, the one that assigns causation to unknown phenomena or things that we cannot immediately tell what their physical basis is. We might look at them as being magical, somehow defying the normal conventions that bind our physical world. So religion often has this characteristic. Religion assumes that there's a supernatural God that lives in a different place, that has no constraints of time and space and physical being and all that stuff. So in that sense, religion is magical, but it is not explicitly magical, and it does have other elements that are decidedly non-magical. So the two are not synonymous, but things that lack a demonstrable physical basis, but in which we nonetheless believe. Can I talk in English? Who knows? At any rate, they all kind of have similar characteristics, and that's why we group them together in this case. So as children, before we can comprehend the real world in a systematic and adult way, we often are trained to believe in fairies and goblins and ghosts and all that other stuff. And we enjoy it. And we watch movies that do this, we read books that make this case. It becomes part of our thinking, even as we're acquiring the capacity for physical causality in the real world. We're still developing this other thought process in us as well. Then we grow up, and ostensibly, we don't use magical thinking anymore. That's the hallmark of growing up. You discard these fanciful ideas that have no basis in reality. They're enjoyable diversions, good stories. Maybe you trot out your favorite goblin or ghost at Halloween, And if you're into it, zombies and zombie apocalypses are just sort of a fun diversion in adulthood, particularly when we introduce them to the classics like Pride and Prejudice. But we really don't think they're real any longer, do we? Let's think about this. If you go into a haunted house and it's properly lit, and maybe there's some scary background music, and maybe there's cold air in there, and possibly, weird things are flying around in the dark, making screeching noises. If the scene is set properly, then you can be induced to, for instance, be told to put your hands into a bowl of cold, wet spaghetti noodles, and if somebody tells you those are human intestines, you might recoil in horror and scream and run from the room, because in that moment with that kind of environment around you, it seems real, even though to do so in broad daylight without all of these inducements would strike you as really stupid, because it's spaghetti noodles, but in the right circumstances, they become something else. So we have to ask if, in the real world, even when we're adults, did we really give up magical thinking? Well, here's a survey. It's a Harris poll from 2009, not too long ago. And the people who took the poll were asked whether they believe in the things on the list you see below. Do they believe in God? Yes, 82%. Do they believe in miracles? Yes, 76%. How about heaven? 75% say yes. Angels? 72% say yes. Does the soul, whatever it is, survive death? 71% said yes. What about hell? Well, smaller number, but 61% said, yeah, I think there's a hell. What about the devil? Yes, 61% said yes. What about Darwin's theory of evolution? Only 45% said, yes, it's real stuff, which is a bit of a concern for people like me. More people believe in angels and devils than they do in Darwin's theory of evolution in the United States. It should not be particularly surprising then that 40% of Americans say they believe in creationism, the idea that the supernatural God created humans in their present form about 4,000 years ago. And if we go down the list, things get a little more fanciful. What about UFOs? 32% say yes. Astrology, as distinct from astronomy. Stop that. A surprising number, a quarter of Americans say astrology is true. Your horoscopes are true. Witches, 23% say yes. And reincarnation, which is a competing religious idea, not Christian, 20% say, yeah, we get reincarnated for sure. So a lot of actual scientists are interested in exploring why people have these persistent views about things that, as far as we can tell, and as far as we can measure, lack an actual basis in reality. It could be that we adults are much more susceptible to these ideas than we thought previously, in part because we're trained to believe these things as young children. And as a consequence, we live with these two belief systems, at least these two belief systems, in our heads. And therefore, when we end up being grown-ups and adults, we still hang on to some of those beliefs, even though ostensibly we know that they don't exist or they're not true. And now the scientists who are studying this have demonstrated that having these differing belief systems has legitimate evolutionary roots. There's a study in psychology in which college students were given a bunch of darts and asked to throw those darts at pictures that had been taped to the wall. They weren't told to throw at a particular picture, but they were told just to throw darts at pictures. Some of those pictures were neutral in their aspects. For instance, you might see a base shaped like a circle, which looked kind of like a Walmart happy face, and I would definitely throw a dart at that, but that's just me. Other pictures weren't neutral, and some of them were faces of human babies. And the interesting thing that they found in this research was that these students, college students, simply would not throw darts at pictures of babies. They'd throw it at everything else, including adult humans, but they would not throw them at babies. Why? They're just pictures. What would be the big deal? Well, according to the researchers, the picture of the object was sufficiently real that it felt like throwing darts at actual babies. That's how it got internalized. And this, according to Paul Rosen, who conducted the study at the University of Pennsylvania, is what we call an example of the magical law of similarity, which is a subconscious association of an image with an object. So if something bad, like having a dart pierce it, happens to the image, at the gut, visceral level, we think that that thing was actually hurt. And that is why the students would not throw darts at pictures of a baby, because they had internalized the magical law of similarity. They knew in their conscious mind that the baby wasn't hurt, but their primitive gut reaction, their type 1 response, was that it's wrong to throw a dart at a picture of a baby. So the question is then, is this so-called magical thinking somehow adaptive? And did it improve our chances of reproduction as hunter-gatherers? Well, another researcher, Tamar Gendler of Yale University, says yes. In fact, she has a term to describe an innate and habitual reaction that might be at odds with our conscious beliefs. The term she uses to describe this is belief. Beliefs can motivate us to take or withhold actions, even though we know that it isn't necessary. An example that she gave is, if you offered a student a chocolate bar and said, would you like to have it? The student would probably say yes. But if you gave that student a chocolate bar that was shaped like feces, the student would probably say, oops, no thanks. In fact, that's what she showed in her research, that they would reject chocolate if it was shaped like feces, even though they knew it was chocolate and would not hurt them, nor did it taste like feces, because it wasn't. So the conscious says, do not be ridiculous, eat the chocolate. But the subconscious, belief, says, whoa, don't even touch that, let alone eat it. So beliefs are very deeply ingrained. They're hard to override. But back in the day, they may have protected us from bad things, like eating contaminated food that had fecal contamination and might make us sick. Or so goes the explanation. And now we need to introduce a new player into this saga. His name is Michael Shermer. In his younger years, he was an evangelical Christian, and true to the name evangelical, he evangelized. He would solicit his friends, his family, people on the street. He'd ask them to accept Christ as their Savior. He would work on you at dinner parties, at social events, and so forth, and people would kind of roll their eyes when they saw him coming. But eventually, he had an epiphany, and this was largely a result of doing a PhD that involved Darwinian principles, after which he lost his evangelical faith and became the executive director of Skeptic magazine, which dabbles in all things. Stop it. All things with a physical basis, and is skeptical about those that do not have that property. So in his view, natural selection is the basis for the kind of thinking that we're talking about. The magical thinking that has made it into the human behavioral skill set is of long standing, according to Shermer, and it can be effectively broken into two components to understand its origin. And those two components are patternicity and agenticity, which we'll take up in turn. So beginning with patternicity, this is one of the mechanisms for maintaining beliefs that don't have any demonstrable physical basis. If we think back to our overused example of the hunter-gatherer out there on the savannah, and let us say that he hears a rustling sound behind him in the grass. He has to wonder in his mind, is that a predator looking for me for dinner, or is it simply the wind? Now, if the hunter assumes that it's a tiger, and it turns out to be just the breeze blowing through the grass, he has technically committed what we call a type 1 error, or a false positive. He's believing something is real when it is not. Type 1 error, false positive. And he has just created a non-existent pattern in his mind. So we need to ask, what would be the downside for the hunter of committing this error? If the sound in the grass were an actual tiger, but the hunter decides it's just the wind, and it turns out to be a real tiger, okay, this is not good. He has now committed what we call a type 2 error of cognition. He has committed a false negative, or he has believed something is not real when in fact it is. So he's missed a very important pattern, and the downside in this case is that the tiger will have him for lunch. So you can see that the consequences of these two types of errors are much different. And this now explains the preference for so-called magical thinking. If you commit a type 1 error, that is to say, you think something is not real when it is, there's no harm. But if you commit a type 2 error, thinking something is real, is not, then you are in for the possibility of massive harm. Therefore, it's safer to commit an error that is on the side of believing more things are real when they actually aren't. So natural selection would have favored committing type 1 errors and not bothered to correct them. So why do we do this? Well, the big picture is that the brain tries to organize chaos by looking for patterns. In this way, not every situation has to be treated as novel and has to be analyzed for the first time. It allows us to make predictions. It allows us to connect dots. So creating meaning from patterns has a potential great evolutionary advantage. We know that we are descendants of the hunter-gatherers who were really good at finding meaning in patterns, organizing that chaos. One form of this is that all animals with a cephalized nervous system do it. That is to say, they form simple associations, which we can also consider to be simple patterns. So one of these we've already mentioned. It rained, I got sick, therefore I got sick because it rained. It's a pattern. Or something that's very common, I won the lottery the day I didn't shave. Therefore, I must shave if I want to win the lottery again, or wear my favorite shirt, or perform some strange movement, whatever your particular inducement might be. We make these associations, we create patterns because they help us navigate through the world and keep some of the chaos at bay. So these things that I've just mentioned, these little things that we connect to events, either good or bad, are loosely called superstition, and we all do it. It is in part because the brain of the human did not acquire a parallel error detection function as this kind of associative thinking took root and matured. It's a really good thing to have when life depended on making accurate split-second decisions, like what is the source of that sound in the grass. The ability to see patterns and take critical action was thus a real asset. But as a result, these patterns were internalized, and we use them even when they are unnecessary or simply wrong. So here's a very simple equation for understanding in a semi-quantitative way what's going on here. It was developed by Michael Shermer to explain all of this stuff. So P, which is probability of committing a type 1 error, C type 1, is less than or equal to C type 2. In other words, the probability of committing a type 1 error increases as the cost of believing a false pattern is real, if that is less than or equal to the cost of not believing that a real pattern is false. So it's a matter of balancing the costs of committing those two types of error, and if the type 2 error is much more expensive to commit, which it is in the example of the hunter-gatherer and the sand in the grass, then it means that we won't develop a correction function for committing type 1 errors because the cost is not high enough to bother. We also know that humans want and expect causality, and that the inability to assign causal probability to all events can cause a lot of mental anguish. So this causes us to lump causal associations together with non-causal ones, if only because it increases our repertoire of causes to which we can assign things. So now there's an evolutionary reason for superstition, which is to say that natural selection favors those strategies that result in incorrect causal connections in order to ingrain those that are essential for survival and reproduction. So we put up with type 1 errors because they don't cause much damage, but on the other hand, type 2 errors can be lethal, so we have over-invested in these kinds of corrections. And thus, an overextension of patternicity causes us to find meaningful connections where no connection exists. And there's a legitimate evolutionary reason for this, as we've just discussed. Establishing true patterns helps us survive, but an overextension of that pattern association is also a protective device. Establishing false positive patterns, type 1 errors in other words, doesn't hurt us. Therefore, false positive patterns escape the winnowing force of natural selection. They weren't corrected for because they didn't cause enough of a problem to make it necessary. So we have some examples of overextending this patternicity in modern times. If, for instance, you have a friend who has cancer and hears that a diet of eating only seaweed can cure it, there's no evidence, there's no double-blind studies to support it, but nonetheless, it's the situation where the friend is desperate and will grasp at any straw, however unlikely that it'll work. This is a pattern association. You probably are aware that there's a fairly big controversy over vaccines causing autism, the data for which are quite conclusive. It does not. There's nothing in the vaccine that will cause autism, but because people with really cute kids and perhaps star power credentials go on TV and make that case, people believe it. They're forming an association based on the authority of others. And therefore, we have a bunch of people who do not vaccinate their children. This is how conspiracy theories get started, how they get perpetuated, and also how we use superstition to create false associations among large groups of people who otherwise would not be so motivated. B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist, did a lot of studies on superstition. He did it experimentally, often with pigeons. He taught the birds to peck a lever in order to receive a treat. And as long as the treat was delivered right after the peck, he pressed the lever, there was no problem. The pigeons would do it pretty reliably. But if the interval between the peck and the reward was varied, the birds started to show all sorts of crazy, bizarre behaviors like hopping and whooping and twirling and rotating clockwise and then counterclockwise and just weird stuff. But it turns out humans do the same thing. So watch any high-powered sports event, whether it's golf or baseball or shooting things. They all do this. Sometimes they have generally very complicated rituals that they have to perform before they do their sport, whatever it is. Or maybe they just have to wear something that they wore the last time they were successful. But it's ingrained in the human psyche. We do this too, even though we understand at another level that this is crazy. It makes no difference. Uncertainty makes us anxious and can rapidly lead us into the zone of magical thinking if we're susceptible to it. And that kind of patternicity, the willingness to find relationships between unassociated things, can also be related to emotions. This would be the case with the children and autism issue, and particular states of being on that particular day. Are you sick? Are you hungry? These are things that can affect your ability to develop patterns. And now moving on to agenticity. We're going to have to go back to our poor hunter-gatherer friend still out there on the savannah. And again, hearing the wind, which in this case represents an inanimate force. And the predator in this scenario is an intentional agent. The predator has intentions, which in this case is to eat the hunter-gatherer. Now, most animals can distinguish between the inanimate force and the intentional agent, at least at an elementary level. But humans and our huge brains go much further. In fact, we've created a whole theory of mind, which is the ability to discern mental states as intentions, both within ourselves and also in others. And Michael Shermer takes it one step further. He says that agenticity is the tendency or the desire to invest patterns themselves with meaning. Wow, that's interesting. Also, intention and agency. So patterns invested with agency achieve the status of controller of world events. And these things can include souls and spirits and ghosts and gods and demons and agents, even governments and other invisible agents. People who believe that these things haunt our world can also control our lives. So patternicity and agenticity form the basis for some really interesting mindsets, including shamanism, paganism, animism, Old and New spiritualism, and perhaps even religion. But no, we don't have to worry, right? Because now we're in modern times and all of this is gone. Or is it? Well, we have another researcher to talk about. This is a psychologist too. His name is Bruce Hood. And he has documented data that show agency investment of inanimate objects and people and animals happens because we create an essence in them that makes them who they are and which can be transmitted to others, which he calls essentialism. He argues that this has an evolutionary root. It probably evolved from our fear of contracting bad diseases and other natural calamities, and natural selection favored actions that would help us avoid sick people. But then this got extended to both natural and supernatural phenomena, as well as objects and beings, which were subsequently invested with agency and intention. And the critical experiment that Bruce Hood did to illustrate this point was that he got a bunch of adults together and asked all of these people, they were all healthy, they were asked to rate the faces of 20 pictures of people for attractiveness and intelligence. After that, they were asked to comment upon whether they would be willing to receive a heart transplant from each of them. They recorded their ratings, and then Hood told the subjects that half of the people in those pictures were convicted murderers, and he had the subjects re-rate them. After that happened, it turned out that all of the people identified as murderers went down in attractiveness and intelligence. But the biggest drop between the first rating and the second rating was that the willingness of people to receive a heart transplant from the murderers fell precipitously. And this reflects the idea that some evil essence found in the murderers that made them commit murder could be transferred to the recipient of the heart. That's what we mean by essentialism. There's this essence that can be moved from one person to the next. Now, this is why people want to do weird things, like if Elvis or your favorite rock star is up on stage getting all hot and sweaty and he takes off his shirt or his scarf or whatever and gives it away to somebody in the audience, somebody will leap at the chance to get a sweaty scarf from Elvis. Okay, he can't anymore because he's dead, but, substitute your favorite rock star. That is another example of essentialism. And here is your study guide for Do You Believe in Magic?